Well, we are in the midst of the dog days of summer. I've been deadheading basil nonstop. The long hot peppers on my balcony are producing a copious crop. Dog days has come to mean the longest and hottest and most humid days of summer, but it didn't originally mean that. It actually has an astrological origin. This is the time of year when the bright dog star Sirius, following the hunter Orion across the heavens, is visible in the eastern sky just before sunrise. Now, the ancients associated that return of the dog star not just with scorching heat. It also meant flooding, bad storms, and bad luck. They believed that the dog days were a time when you were likely to be overwhelmed at any minute by disaster. Well, feeling overwhelmed is not, of course, limited to the ancient world. I've been reading the British theologian David Ford, who has a book about being overwhelmed. I thought it would be a good one to read during the week and a half when I'm the solo pastor on call. And he writes about how our generation, more than any at any time in history, can get overwhelmed by so many different things. And thinking about my own life, every week, I'm threatened to be overwhelmed by this deluge of news that's just thrown at me and out of control. And our schedules get overwhelmed too, of course. We want to do as much as we possibly can, especially this time of year when summer's almost over and we pack more in than we can. I know many of you feel overwhelmed by financial pressures. There are intense cultural forces that push us to live in a certain way of life, to accumulate more, bigger, better. I spoke with a grandmother recently, and she told me that her grandchildren are in daycare for 12 hours every day, and they only have a tiny amount of time to spend with their parents because they have overwhelming jobs. And I've talked to young adults who feel intense pressure to perform, and some of them feel inadequate because they know they'll never achieve the financial success of a sibling or even their parents. And on top of all of those pressures, there are the crises that blindside you. Job loss, health problems, the death of a loved one. We often feel like we're treading in water in a big flood. Well, we're in the ethical section of the book of Ephesians that we've been going through over the past year, and it sounds like a lot of do's and don'ts, doesn't it? But Ephesians starts with this great theological buildup, and then this is the now so what? This is how you live if God is really this vast cosmic unity. Well, a friend of mine asked me what we were preaching on over the summer, and I read him this text, and when I did, he said, "What a buzzkill." And he was referring, of course, to the part where it says, "Don't get drunk." That was the only thing that stood out to him from this text. Because, he said, you're going to have this text in the middle of summer. That's when people want to crack open another cold one, mix up the mojitos, pass the Prosecco to escape from their overwhelming lives. And then we have to hear Paul say to us, "Don't get drunk." I was thinking about that, and I realized that I don't think I've heard any preacher talk about alcohol since the fundamentalist church that I grew up in. We just don't from the pulpit. Maybe we don't want to sound moralistic. So I decided, well, I'm going to talk a little bit about alcohol today. It's in the text, right? And Oktoberfest is coming up in a month, too. So it's no surprise to those of you who know me, I grew up in a family of teetotalers. And it's not because they were dour legalists. My parents were really a lot of fun. They just knew how to have fun without the lubrication of alcohol. And they were part of a tradition that abstained from alcohol because they knew of all the potential damage that it can do. So I never saw my parents drunk, not once in my life, and I never saw them drink, although, well, maybe once. After my dad died in 2003, Joe and I took my mother on a cruise to Alaska. She'd always want to go to Alaska. She was 79 years old. Before we'd even left port, we went out on deck on top to look at the view, see Seattle, and of course there was a bar nearby. I'd never been on a cruise before, and I haven't since, but I learned right away, when you're on a cruise, there's always a bar nearby. And Joe said, we got some drinks, and Joe said to her, "Hey, Mrs. C," that's what he calls her, Mrs. C. "Mrs. C, would you like to try a pina colada?" And she said, "What's that?" And he said, "Well, it's sort of like an adult Slurpee. It tastes like pineapple and coconut." And she said, "Sure." And she took a sip of the pina colada, and her eyes grew big like this, and that thing was slurped down in no time at all. And I'll have another one. So she slept really well that night. So is Paul being a buzzkill? Is he being a killjoy, a guilt trip? Is he condemning a little old 79-year-old lady for enjoying a couple of pina coladas? Well, notice what he says, don't get drunk. He doesn't say, don't drink. Now, I think it's important to say here, he's saying don't get drunk to people who are able to stop. Some people can't say stop. We know that just saying no doesn't work. So addictions are far more complex than that, and that's not what I'm talking about this morning. The Bible itself is ambivalent about strong drink. It has both praise for the goodness of wine that gladdens the heart, as well as warnings about wine, the mocker and the brawler. So, does anyone know who the first person to get drunk in the Bible is? Who's that? Noah. Somebody who's read Genesis. Exactly. Noah's not all about rainbows, tigers, and giraffes. It happens shortly after his family leaves the ark. And I think it's an interesting story to reflect upon about why his story might lead to drunkenness. So think about what happens to him. He's in this overwhelming flood that overwhelms the entire world that he knows. And then on top of that, he's given the responsibility of taking care of every surviving species of land animals. I mean, you talk about job responsibility, that's overwhelming. And then after the flood, when he and his family get off the ark, what does he see? We're the only sole survivors of a cataclysmic catastrophe that's wiped out all life on the planet. It's not such a happy story in the end, is it? So Noah has come prepared on the ark because as soon as he gets off, he plants vines. Apparently he knew he'd need them. And he waits long enough for those vines to grow in order to produce grapes so he can make wine out of the grape juice, and then he can get drunk. That's a long time to wait for a drink. But the thing about this story is he survived this disaster that could have overwhelmed him, but finally he just succumbs to being overwhelmed. There are, of course, many good reasons not to get drunk. Countless families have been destroyed because of alcohol abuse. It often leads to violent outbursts, drunk driving deaths, a lot of regrets, and just the humiliation of texting while drunk. Paul doesn't list any of those reasons for drinking responsibly. He says, don't get drunk because it leads to debauchery. Now, debauchery is an unfortunate translation there. In the Greek that Paul spoke, he's really just saying, don't get drunk because it's a waste. Getting drunk is a waste. So you see, it was Paul and not the hippies who invented the term wasted. Anyone who's ever been hungover, and I'm sorry to admit that includes myself, anybody who's ever been hungover knows what the waste is that getting drunk produces. It's a waste of time. It wastes the whole next day, right? Paul writes, make the most of the time, because these are desperate times. Make the most of the time. The old King James Version there reads, redeem the time. Now, redeem is an economic term, and it's about buying stuff up. We talk about spending time, but redeem the time means buy up as much time while you possibly can. Make the most of the time. Get it while you can. So how does Paul recommend that we make the most of our time? Singing. Did you notice that? What an odd thing for him to single out as the most important thing that we can do with our time. Sing, make melody in your hearts. In an address to the World Council of Churches at Northwestern in 1954, Dwight Eisenhower said, I have two kinds of problems, the urgent and the important. The urgent are not important, and the important are never urgent. The important is never urgent. Funding pensions, maintaining infrastructure, investing in good education, workforce development with inner city youth, long-term strategic planning, all of that's very important, but we don't feel like it's urgent. our politicians and the people who elect them just keep kicking those important things down the road. We also neglect what's important on a personal level. Spending time with the people we love, reading good books, learning to cook and sew or play an instrument, bird watching, gardening, everything that makes life truly rich and good. None of that is urgent, but it's vitally important. I officiated at 2 memorial services over the past 2 days, and they were very different families and situations, but I heard one consistent theme from the children that spoke at both services. Their parents gave them the gift of time. One son spoke about how when he came out of the closet to his father, he was living on the other side of the country. His father dropped everything and flew there the next day just so he could have dinner with his son so that his son would know how much he was loved. Another son spoke about how his mother took time to share what she loved with him, and she loved to dance. And so she taught her children all how to dance, and now that love lives on as part of his life. Important, but not urgent. Well, at the top of Paul's list of important but not urgent is singing. Now, unless you're in a Broadway musical and suddenly feel a song coming on, singing's really not urgent, but singing is deeply important because the songs of praise that we sing in church have the power to shape our lives. Whatever threatens to overwhelm you needs to be overwhelmed by something bigger. Now, liquor we know won't do that trick. It temporarily anesthetizes, but you wake up feeling even more overwhelmed. Neither will consumerism. There is no house possibly big enough that can store all of the overwhelming pain that inevitably comes in life. Only God can overwhelm what threatens to overwhelm us. Praise and worship of the God who is beyond all praising orients our perspective to what is true, the God from whom all blessings flow. And this is the main book of Ephesians, that God is gathering everything up together in Christ. That's our basic reality. Our basic reality isn't fear, pressure, anxiety, whatever threatens to overwhelm you. The most fundamental reality of our everyday lives is the amazing grace of God. That's the reality that we baptized Sean and Patrick into this morning, that their lives ultimately belong to a faithful and loving God. Now, that truth is so amazing that you can only sing it. You can only sing it in a doxology. That truth is so amazing that we have to be reminded of it again and again because everything else competes with it. That's why worshiping together is so important week after week. It's one of the most important, non-urgent, life-affirming, countercultural things that we can do. Christians know there was one reality that overwhelms every other overwhelming. Christ rules the world in truth and grace and love. Therefore, we have time. We have time to say no to the urgent and time to say yes to the important. We have time to sing. Amen.